Welcome to the debate. Take a look at the device in your hand right now, or, just look down at the shirt you're wearing. If you really trace the history of those objects, the raw materials, the hands that assembled them, the ships that carried them, you aren't just looking at a single product. You are looking at a map of the entire world. Today, we are talking about globalization. And we aren't using that word as some throwaway buzzword for international business. We are talking about the fundamental architecture of the modern world, the process that is making every citizen on this planet increasingly connected and interdependent.
Well, interdependent is it's a very polite way of putting it. It sounds like we're all holding hands.
Right.
But I think we really need to look at what that grip actually feels like. Is it a handshake or is it a shackle? Because the central question we have to grapple with today isn't just whether we are connected. I mean, we obviously are. But to what extent this process influences our lives and our core identities. Is this global village actually enriching us? Or is it a force that, erodes our autonomy and turns distinct cultures into this sort of gray commercial mush?
I see why you frame it as an erosion of autonomy, especially when the change happens so fast. But I would argue that what we are seeing is actually an explosion of possibility. Marshall McLuhan coined that term, the global village, back in the 60s. And he wasn't just talking about trade. He was talking about a nervous system that spans the entire planet. We are living in what the material calls a woven world. Whether it's the cotton in your T-shirt being grown in Egypt, spun in India, and sold in Toronto. Or the fact that a kid in rural Saskatchewan can learn coding from a tutor in Bangalore. This integration drives efficiency. It drives cultural exchange. It fundamentally breaks down the silos that used to keep us poor and isolated.
I just come at it from a completely different way. You describe a woven world like it's a beautiful tapestry, but I see a tangled web of corporate power that really traps local communities. You mentioned the T-shirt. Let's actually look at that T-shirt. It's not just efficiency that moves that cotton around the world. It's a race to the bottom.
Well, transnational corporations, they move production to wherever the wages are lowest and the environmental regulations are the loosest. My concern is that this dynamic creates a world where local culture and local economies are simply steamrolled by a homogenized, corporate-driven model. We aren't just sharing ideas, we are importing a very specific, usually American, commercialism that displaces everything that was there before.
I think that's a pretty cynical view of what is, for most people, a massive upgrade in their standard of living. Let's look at the economic dimension first, because that's really where the rubber meets the road here. Think about a typical Saturday afternoon. You might pop into a boutique and buy earrings made by an artisan in Nepal.
Right.
Then you head to a massive retailer like Walmart to buy jeans for $20. Then maybe you grab a burger at Wendy's. In 3 hours, you've engaged with the US, South Asia, and a vast global logistics network. You call it commercialism, but I call it access. That typical Saturday represents a democratization of goods that, frankly, kings and queens didn't have a century ago.
But let's peel back the layers of that Saturday. It's not just about the convenience of the shopper. It's about the destruction of the landscape. When you buy those $20 jeans at Walmart, you are participating in a system that relies on transnational corporations, TNCs. These aren't just big companies. They are entities that often have more economic power than the actual countries they operate in.
Sure, their scale is massive.
Right, and they don't just sell goods, they reshape entire communities. When a giant like that moves into a town, buying in bulk and undercutting everyone else, the local shop owner, the guy who sponsors the Little League team, the woman who actually knows your name, they can't compete with that. They fold.
But they fold because the consumer, the actual people living in that community, choose the lower price. You really can't ignore the agency of the shopper here. If we look at the data from around 2005, Walmart held almost 52% of the department store retail trade in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, 52%. That is a staggeringly high number. But that isn't a corporate army forcing people to buy jeans at gunpoint. That is millions of families voting with their wallets. They are voting for efficiency. They are voting to stretch their paycheck further. If the local shop was serving their needs better, they would still be there.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's simply a free vote. It's a manufactured lack of options. This is exactly how you get what urban planners call dead retail zones. Picture the main street of a small town. It used to be vibrant, right? Hardware stores, grocers, clothing boutiques. Now, boarded up windows. Maybe a secondhand store or a payday loan place.
It changes the zoning, yes.
It guts the town because the economic heart of the community was transplanted to a concrete box on the outskirts surrounded by a sea of asphalt. We are trading the distinct character of our communities, those third places where we actually interact with our neighbors, for cheap goods. We are trading independence for a supply chain we have absolutely zero control over.
Dependency implies we are helpless, though. I'd argue it's mutual reliance. And we have to be realistic about what TNCs provide. It's not just cheap jeans. It's jobs, often entry-level jobs for teenagers or supplemental income for seniors. It's one-stop shopping for a single parent who just doesn't have time to visit 4 different specialty stores after work. You see a dead retail zone, but an economist sees a maturation of the logistics network. Look at 2004. Canada exported over $400 billion in goods. That flow of capital is what funds our hospitals and schools. You simply can't have the high standard of living we enjoy without that trade efficiency.
But efficiency at what cost? You talk about jobs? Let's talk about the quality of those jobs and the power dynamics between the worker and the global giant. Because this isn't theoretical. The Walmart phenomenon isn't just about logistics. It's about control. And there is a specific case that we need to discuss because it perfectly illustrates why I don't share your optimism here. We need to talk about Jonquière, Quebec.
I had a feeling you would bring up Jonquière. It's the classic case study.
It's classic for a reason. In 2005, the workers at the Jonquière Walmart decided they weren't happy with their conditions, and they did something incredibly brave. They voted to become the first unionized Walmart in North America. They joined the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. This was a pure moment of local agency. People in a small town trying to assert their rights against the biggest retailer on earth.
Right. They exercised their legal right to organize.
And what was the response? Did the global village listen? Did the TNC negotiate? No. Shortly after the vote, Walmart announced they were closing the store. They just shut it down. 190 people lost their jobs. The company claimed it was purely a financial decision, that the store was struggling. But come on. To the workers and to the mayor of Jonquière, who was absolutely furious about this, it didn't look like a balance sheet decision. It looked like a warning shot. It was a message to every other worker in North America: organize, and we will wipe you off the map.
I think we have to be careful about assigning intent like that, even if the optics were undeniably terrible. The company's stance, and this is a hard reality of business, was that the store was not profitable. When you unionize a model that relies entirely on razor-thin margins, the math often stops working. If the costs go up and the prices can't go up because then customers leave for a competitor, the business fails. I'm not saying it's not brutal for those 190 employees. It is, but is that a failure of globalization, or is it just the reality of market economics?
It's a failure of democracy within the economy. That is exactly my point. You say market reality, I say corporate bullying. If a community cannot legally organize to improve their standard of living without the capital fleeing to a cheaper location, then we don't have interdependence. We have a hostage situation. The TNC holds the keys. They can pick up and leave, moving to a place with lower labor standards, but the workers are stuck there. That massive imbalance of power is inherent to this system.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it treats the economy as a static, zero-sum game. Yes, capital moves, but that movement also brings development to new areas. And frankly, the consumer is complicit in that movement. We demand the lowest price, which forces the company to seek the lowest cost. But let's pivot for a second, because you mentioned identity earlier. You seem to think globalization is turning us all into, corporate clones. I actually think the social dimension is where the global village shines the brightest.
Shines, or blinds. Because when I look at the social dimension, I see a tidal wave of Americanization.
See, I think that's the fear speaking, not the evidence. The source material talks about the paradox of globalization. It's a fascinating concept. The paradox is that as we become more the same, we also become more diverse.
That sounds like a riddle, not an economic argument. How can we possibly be both?
Because the flow of information isn't a one-way street anymore. Yes, you have the sameness, the infrastructure, the technology, the platforms, but on top of that, we have access to more cultural diversity than any human beings in history. We aren't just locked into our local village culture. We have access to Bollywood, an industry churning out 1,000 films a year, completely distinct from Hollywood. We can listen to Swedish hip-hop, watch Korean dramas, follow Congolese football stars. This isn't erasure, it's an explosion of choice. You can curate an identity that draws from the entire human experience.
That is a compelling argument on paper, but have you considered the depth of that engagement? I worry that what you call diversity is often just surface-level consumption. It's purely aesthetic. Look at the sameness side of that paradox again. Go to Tokyo, go to Calgary, go to Rio, look at the teenagers. They are wearing the exact same low-cut jeans. They have the same bling. They are spiking their hair the same way. Why? Because they are all watching the same American music videos on the same global platforms.
But fashion has always been about trends. Why is it inherently worse if the trend is global rather than just national?
Because it displaces the living culture of the place. Anthropologists have been warning about this for years. When television and now the algorithmic internet creeps into every living room, it removes people from their immediate social environment. The conversation at the kitchen table, the local folklore, the specific way a community tells its own stories, that gets replaced by a rerun of Friends. We are failing to participate in our own local culture because we are too busy passively consuming a packaged, globalized one. We are trading deep, local connection for a woven world of superficial entertainment. I mean, we know more about the Kardashians than we do about our own city council.
I think that view really underestimates the creativity of the people doing the consuming. You're treating them as passive vessels just sitting there absorbing American TV. But look at what actually happens when cultures collide. It's not replacement, it's synthesis. Look at Bhangra pop.
Bhangra? You mean the dance music?
Exactly, but look at its roots. Bhangra started as a folk dance in the Punjab region of India. It was specific, local, performed during the harvest. Authentic, as you would say. But then, immigrants brought it to Britain. And it didn't just stay in a museum case. It hit the clubs. It mixed with the local sounds of the UK Black community, reggae, hip-hop, R&B, garage.
But is it still Bhangra at that point, or is it just a commodified pop product?
It's something entirely new. It's a hybrid. It has the DNA of the Punjab and the DNA of London. It created a genre that spoke to a whole generation of diasporic kids who felt both Indian and British. This isn't the loss of identity. It is the expansion of it. The woven world allows for these creative hybrids that enrich the human experience. If we stayed in our silos, that music just wouldn't exist.
I will grant you that hybridization can produce beautiful art. Absolutely. But my concern is about power. Who owns the record label? Who owns the distribution platform? And this naturally leads us to the political dimension. You speak of this woven world as if it's a level playing field where cultures just happily mix and match. But in the political sphere, we see that globalization often feels like a direct imposition of values. Governments are no longer sovereign bubbles. They are constantly pressured by international agreements, by the G8, by NATO, by the UN.
And I would argue that is a necessary evolution. We are facing problems that simply do not respect borders. A cloud of smog doesn't stop at the border guard. A pandemic doesn't need a passport. Political globalization allows us to build the structures to actually solve these things. When a massive natural disaster hits, nations from all over the world coordinate aid. That is political globalization in action. International treaties on climate change, that's the only way we survive. We need to erode absolute sovereignty to solve global problems.
I agree that humanitarian aid is a clear benefit. But we have to ask, who controls the message? Who decides what the global values actually are? Because often it feels like Western values are being exported as the default setting for humanity.
Can you give me a specific example of where you see that friction playing out?
Sure. Look at the reaction of the Iranian government to international television a few years back. They actually labeled the watching of international satellite TV a sinful act. Now, we might sit here in the West and roll our eyes at that, or call it oppressive. But look at it from their perspective. They felt that this media was exposing their citizens to liberal values of the West that fundamentally conflicted with their traditional religious culture. They saw it as a cultural invasion. And in a way, they were right.
political and social globalization is an invasion. It treats Western democracy and consumerism as a one-size-fits-all solution for the entire planet.
That is a highly complex issue, and obviously I'm not defending censorship. But there is another way to look at that exact scenario. As one observer noted regarding the Middle East, television brings the spectacle of public disagreement, of debate, of democracy into places where that was previously unknown. It shows people that leaders can be questioned. Is that an imposition? Perhaps. But it also offers a window into alternative ways of living. It allows people to make informed choices about how they want to be governed. Information is power.
But is it really a choice? That is what I keep coming back to in this whole debate. When the economic pressure of TNCs wipes out your local business options, and the social pressure of global media homogenizes your fashion and your values, and the political pressure forces your government to align with international norms, where is the actual choice?
The choice is in how we adapt. We are not victims of this process. We are active participants.
Let's look at the balance sheet then. I want the listener to really weigh this. On one side, yes, we have more stuff. We have cheap jeans from Walmart, we have electronics full of global components, and we can watch Friends in 100 different countries. But the cost is incredibly high. We see the dead retail zones turning our vibrant towns into ghost towns. We see the suppression of labor organizing, like we saw in Junquier when the workers tried to stand up to a global giant and just got crushed. We risk losing the traditional communication of the kitchen table to the dazzle of TV land. I would urge everyone listening to really ask themselves, is the lowest price really worth the social cost?
And I would ask them to consider the alternative. An isolated world is a poorer world, both economically and culturally. Globalization is an unstoppable force of connection. Yes, there are challenges. The unionization debate is a real and difficult conversation we need to have, and we need to manage that transition better. But the benefits of the global village, from the ability to coordinate disaster relief to the creative explosion of things like Panga Pop, these fundamentally enrich the human experience. We are not just losing old identities, we are forging new, more complex ones. The woven world offers us opportunities our ancestors could never have imagined.
It offers opportunities, certainly, but it requires us to be exceptionally vigilant about what we are losing in the process. We can't just accept the gift without checking the price tag.
And that is exactly where the listener comes in. We can't decide this for you. You have to look at your own life, from the playlist on your phone to the items in your grocery cart.
Check where your shirt was made. Check who owns the store you're shopping in. Ask yourself what used to be there before.
Exactly. Decide for yourself the extent of this influence and whether the connection is worth the trade-offs.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.